Welcome back. Bienvenue à nouveau. Alors, nous entreprenons maintenant la troisième session sur l'espérance, les espoirs et les responsabilités pour le futur de notre monde. Hopes and responsibilities for tomorrow's world. Nous avons vu hier et ce matin comment notre univers est stable, mais aussi très fragile. Nous avons reçu aussi ce matin des avertissements, warnings, à propos des crises que nous traversons, à propos du réchauffement de la planète, réchauffement des océans, inondation des terres, consommation effrénée, avec aussi l'appel à regarder la vie comme si nous ne la connaissions pas. Et malgré et en dépit de tout cela, et surtout, nous avons reçu hier l'appel à peut-être avoir une autre conception de la relation entre le créé, la création et le créateur, qui est davantage basée sur une alliance. Alors, nous sommes appelés à porter un regard confiant et positif sur le futur de notre monde. Un regard qui n'est pas béat, mais qui est actif et qui prend en charge cette responsabilité de bâtir un monde meilleur, un monde inclusif et non pas exclusif, un monde qui se construit avec cette conception d'un travail et d'une alliance entre the Earth System and the Human System. Un monde qui se construit dans le souci de protéger toute la création, incluant bien sûr l'espèce humaine. Un monde qui se construit dans la recherche du bien commun et de la solidarité avec ceux et celles qui sont et qui vivent en marge de notre société, de notre monde. Mais toujours avec cette assurance qu'il y a de l'avenir, parce que notre avenir est en Dieu, et nous espérons Dieu de Dieu. Alors, ce matin, nous allons avoir deux présentations qui vont nous parler justement de cette responsabilité de développer cette espérance et dans la construction d'un monde meilleur, le domaine de l'éducation et le domaine des soins de santé. Et je laisse à ma collègue et amie Margarita Boffarol de présenter notre premier présentateur, speaker.
Buenos días. Muchas gracias, señor Simar. Antes de presentar al siguiente orador, quiero recordarles que pueden hacer sus preguntas a través de los papeles que se les ha repartido, si no pueden solicitar más, y también a las personas que nos están siguiendo online, que pueden hacer sus preguntas a través del chat. Tengo el gusto de presentar al profesor Gentenhaf. El profesor Gentenhaf nació en los Países Bajos, estudió medicina y trabajó como médico en los servicios de salud municipales de la ciudad de Rotterdam. Estudió también filosofía y trabajó en las universidades de Maastricht y de Nijmegen en Holanda. Fue director de la División de Ética en Ciencia y Tecnología de la UNESCO en París. Y quiero recordar, porque me parece muy remarcable, que bajo su dirección el Comité Internacional de Bioética redactó el texto de la Declaración Universal sobre Bioética y Derechos Humanos, que fue adoptado por unanimidad por todos los Estados miembros de la UNESCO en el año 2005. Gracias, profesor. Fue también director del Centro de Salud de la Universidad Duquesne en Pittsburgh, en Estados Unidos, donde es profesor emérito desde el año 2019. También desde el año 2021, el profesor Ten Haaf imparte clases de bioética global en la Universidad de Anáhuac, en México. Como he dicho, es profesor emérito de Ética de la Atención Sanitaria en la Universidad Duquesne en Pittsburgh, Estados Unidos. Es profesor investigador de la Universidad Anáhuac en Ciudad de México y es miembro correspondiente de la Pontificia Academia para la Vida. Profesor Ten Haaf, usted tiene la palabra. Gracias.
Thank you very much. What I will do in my presentation is to focus on the question, what can we do about all these views about the end of the world and the apocalypse that are all around us today in our educational efforts? So first I will look a little bit more into the apocalyptic views as we are facing them today. And then I will focus on the role of education, and I will argue that in education we can do three things. We can look at today from the perspective of the past. We can make a critical examination of the way we respond to these apocalyptic views, and I will make a distinction between different responses to these views. And then third, I will argue that one of the main issues that we can do in ethics and ethics education is to appeal to the moral imagination. It has been mentioned earlier today, and I think that is one way to go beyond apocalyptic views. And then finally, we have to ask the question how we can make this moral imagination operational. Now, first, we are today confronted with an apocalyptic mood. And at least 4 types of apocalyptic views can be discerned: nuclear apocalypse, a pandemic apocalypse, an artificial intelligence apocalypse, and a climate apocalypse. And those are, you can find in the literature, but also in the media, as you are confronted with media every day. And for example, if you look at recent television series, then they all have an apocalyptic view. For example, The Last of Us, Silo, Paradise, Zero Day, they attract an enormous number of viewers, and they sketch a future of humanity that is not very attractive. People live in underground silos, underground bunkers, because the surface of the earth has become uninhabitable. So all these apocalyptic opinions of doom and gloom are all around us. And that has an effect on how people think about the future. And this is one study of thousands of children and young adults in a number of countries around the world. And they ask them the question, do you think the future is frightening? And then you see that all 3/4 of all those interviewed children and young adults, they think it is frightening. They have no optimistic view about the future, and they think that the future is doomed. Of course, those feelings are different in different countries, but they are, in most countries, the majority of young people have those views on the future. If you ask them, you think that humanity is doomed, then you see the same type of answer. Also, depending on the country, some countries they are more pessimistic than other countries, but overall, more than half of our young people, they think that humanity is doomed. And I think that's an enormous challenge for education, because education mostly is aimed at younger people, younger generations, and we try to equip them to face the future. So that's, I think, the challenge of those pessimistic views about the future. We think that the same is reflected in Laudato Si of Pope Francis. And he argues that those doomsday scenarios should be taken seriously. They cannot be ignored or rejected, but they have to be taken seriously. And they reflect something that we are maybe in a way that is not preferable for the continuation of humankind. The risk is that we leave a destroyed and uninhabitable world to future generations. So the concern for future generations should motivate us to take these apocalyptic views very seriously. And it is certainly reflected in how younger people nowadays think about the future. Now, this fear for the future has become no longer a kind of abstract concern, but for many people it's very personal. That as grandparents, for example, you're worried about what will bring the future for your children and grandchildren especially. And that fear, that anxiety is also promoted by the way our information is structured. And psychologists have identified what they call a mean world syndrome. News is only news when it is reflecting something negative. When there is a serious attack somewhere on the world, when there's a war, when there is a fatal disease, that's news. But not the positive aspects that we experience also every day. So we are continuously exposed in the news media and in social media to bad news and violence. And that leads to an increase of pessimism and fatalism. And some psychologists have identified a special psychological syndrome of eco-anxiety, that people have a fear especially for environmental doom. That reflecting a sense of powerless, that we feel against this massive background of bad news and predictions of doom and gloom, we feel vulnerable and powerless. Problems are simply too complex, too global. We cannot address them by our individual agency. If you are convinced that there is a climate catastrophe, our individual behavior is still important, but it will not help to address the direction in which towards the catastrophe. It's also that we notice that all policies among governments at an international level are rather ineffective. They could not even reach agreement on some of the major issues, and if they do, they will not implement it. And if they have reached agreement, they can easily turn it around and reverse the movement of consensus. So problems are too big and too important, intractable. And that reminds us of the myth of the Hydra. Maybe you know from your own education the myth of the Hydra in ancient Greek and ancient Rome. Hercules was asked to fight the Hydra, which was a monster with at least 9 heads. And every time he chopped off a head, 2 new heads are growing on. So individually, as one very strong fighter, he could not win from the Hydra. He could only defeat the Hydra when he had the help of somebody else, of his nephew. Because every time he cut off a head, the nephew burned the wound so that 2 new ones could not grow. So that was the strategy. And the lesson from the Hydra is, if you're faced with a monster, cooperate, work together with somebody else. Now, what is the role of education? And I would argue we first need to take some distance from what is happening now and look at the past. Then we have to examine the responses, look at the present, and then look into the future and use our imagination to think about different scenarios for the future. Now first, we still have to know that education is, for many people, an important force for change. Here you see also the results of a study that in many countries they ask young people, what are the most important factors in determining success? It could be education, hard work, family wealth, or connections, or other issues. And you see in most countries, depending a little bit what country you're talking about, but in most countries education is still a major force for change. And that put a big burden on us as educators, as teachers, in regard to these negative scenarios for the future. Now first, take some distance, I would say, and that's maybe also a typical European point of view, that we look at history and say, well, what we have learned from history when we look at the problems of today. And then you see, we have a long history, particularly in Western culture, of predictions of doom and gloom. This is not the first time that we hear about apocalyptic scenarios. They have always been there, more or less, more outspoken or less outspoken. And here you see some famous works that probably you have heard of that are predicting doom and gloom, decline of civilization, collapse of our society, and trying to go to a kind of non-existence of our way of life. And what is a lesson from all these histories about decline, this discourse of decline, is that humankind has always been more resilient. The civilization has not been lost, it has been transformed, it has moved into another phase, but it still exists and it's there. And humanity has not been lost. So in a way, human civilizations has always shown adaptiveness, the capacity to adapt, to be resilient. And also, we know that humankind has been hit by major pandemics, because you could say, well, maybe some of these apocalyptic scenarios have been reinforced by our experience with the COVID pandemic. But there have been similar and maybe even worse pandemics before in history, like the plague, like smallpox. And still, we are still there. We have survived. We have transformed into a new stage. So that means that we could also take a little bit more distance from all the scenarios that are coming to us today and say, well, maybe we should be more resilient. We have to think about what is going on and how we can overcome all these issues. And we find the same attitude, I would say, in Laudato Si, because here it is concluded in Laudato Si that we know that we can change things. Things can change. We need not be fatalistic, but we need to diagnose exactly what is wrong in our present culture. And you see here some of the diagnoses that are presented in Laudato Si, where the Pope writes that we live in a throwaway culture. We are marked by excessive anthropocentrism. We have a lack of sense of fraternity, and we live in a dominant technocratic paradigm. So those are incentives not to surrender to the mood of fatalism, but to rethink what is going on and to diagnose and re-evaluate our own culture. Now, the second type of response in education is that we critically look at the various responses that these apocalyptic discourses have generated. Now, the first response is rejection. You still have a number of people denying that there's anything wrong. You know, if you look at, for example, the predictions about climate change, there still is a significant majority of people denying that there is a problem. So that's one possible answer, that we simply deny that it's all bad and is all going to collapse. And there's also the argument that this discourse essentially is dangerous because it's too fatalistic. It's creating too much alarm, and therefore it's open to all kinds of extreme positions and reactions. There's also, of course, the historical argument. They say, well, we have overcome all the possible challenges to our existence, and we will be able to do it again. So don't be too negative. And then finally, there's also a number of people who argue that science and technology have solved all the problems of the past, and it can do it again. And there are several successes to mention. For example, we have identified the reason why the ozone layer was affected. We have taken measures. We have identified the causes. We have agreed, all the countries have agreed about appropriate measures to eradicate those chemicals, and look at the ozone layer now, it is going better. So that's one successful example where scientific and technological efforts have been successful in solving a problem. And why couldn't we do that for all other problems that we face? So that's one possible response, that we simply say, well, don't be too nervous about all these apocalyptic views. We will solve it. The second possible response is resignation. That we say, well, it's happening, these processes are too big, too global, too long-term, and we can hardly do anything. So we resign and let it happen. And that's an attitude that you can read in, for example, the work of the Portuguese poet Fernando Pessoa. He said, well, I know that all these things are happening in my life, and the best thing I can do is to make myself invulnerable to everything that happens. So I abstain, I isolate myself, and I take an attitude of indifference. Also, in the past, we know that there have been many movements that are welcoming, in fact, apocalyptic predictions, because they think this is the start of a new beginning. So you shouldn't be afraid of the apocalypse. You should let it happen, because it is giving birth to a new world. And that was a movement of millennialism in the past, all kinds of movements that are accepting the apocalypse as it is coming. We also see it today in movements, for example, as anti-natalism, or as it has called in Britain, birth strike. There's a movement of women arguing that it's better not to have any children. Because if you have children, you only multiply the problems of climate, but also you bring your children into a world that is going down, that is declining. So it's immoral to have children. So that's also a kind of movement where you have to accept that it's going to happen. You cannot do very much about it, and you simply let it go. And in philosophy, we have also some philosophers that have argued that humanity is only a temporary concern, because there are bigger processes, like we heard this morning, processes that are stretching over a very long time, and humanity is only a very recent event, and it will disappear again, and nature will continue to exist. So this is a kind of movement that has been labeled anti-humanism or post-humanism, and say, well, we cannot do very much, we just have to accept the consequences. Then a third response is resistance. And here you see, especially in regard to climate change, that many young people feel attracted to resist this movement. We know what we can do, but the problem is we don't do it. Governments are inactive, they are inert. So we have to move governments into the right direction. And that we can do by non-violent protest. So in my own country, almost every weekend there are non-violent actions of Extinction Rebellion. And that motivates a lot of people, but finally you can do, or you assume that you can do something to resist the trend towards an apocalypse. There are also philosophers, of course, who have argued that we should resist these tendencies and we should fight against a society that is creating these apocalyptic tendencies. And nowadays there is much more interest, for example, in the philosopher Herbert Marcuse, who was very famous when I was a student with his book, The One-Dimensional Man. But now he makes a comeback because he's arguing that we can resist the tendencies in society to reduce human beings to only one technocratic dimension. There's also a movement of rational optimism. And this is a very, very famous and attractive book. It is not the end of the world. If you look at all kinds of scientific data, we can say, well, we live in the best time ever. And we have all the means to continue that time if we use it appropriately. The problem is not that we don't know what to do, but we are reluctant to implement all these measures, all this knowledge for the betterment of the world. So those are three very common responses to these apocalyptic views. And you can say all these responses imply an ethical position. The first one, rejection, is that we say we have no concern in our ethical system for future generations. We're just interested in our well-being at this moment. The second one, resignation, denies any human agency. It's not possible to do anything as an individual in the face of all these developments around us. And resistance means that we value collective action, that maybe we have some visions of a future society. But I would argue they all do not address a very basic question. Why are we uncomfortable with these apocalyptic ideas? And that means that, at least in my view, some basic ethical questions are not addressed. And shortly, we can say that all the discourse on the end of the world should make us think about the end of the world. But end here has two different meanings. End as termination. The discourse on the termination of the world should inspire us to think about the end of the world in the sense of meaning and purpose. What essentially is the purpose of our world? And that's maybe the old question of the catechism. For what purpose are we on earth? What kind of world do we want to create? And we can see that that's the same indication that is given in Laudato Si. The major question, basic ethical question, in responding to the apocalyptic views is, what kind of world do we want to leave to our children and grandchildren? That is the meaning of end in the real sense of the term. The world is not terminated, but should instigate us to think again about its purpose. And that gives rise to, let me kind of, I have to go back. That gives rise to a fourth response to apocalyptic views that I have called reappraisal. We have to reevaluate our current values in order to indicate in what direction we want to move when we think about the future. The future is still open, it's not obliterated, it is endangered, but we can make a change in the future that we really want. And in order to do that, we need our imagination. And imagination has been called this morning, but it's a kind of faculty that is particularly useful, I would say, in educational efforts. And here you see several formulations about imagination. Let us say, philosopher Ernst Cassirer, for example, he argued that all philosophers, all ethical philosophers, have used the imagination to think about possibilities to improve the current situation of humankind. We also see it in the works of Henry Newman. We see it in the philosophy of Mary Midgley. they say, well, the role is not simply that we humans have the capacity to reason, to deliberate, but we have also a strong capacity to imagine another world, a better future. And that is related also to what we heard today, this morning, about symbolic, the importance of symbolic thinking. And we do that mainly by imagining what can happen. Now, the imagination is not only a reproductive activity, it's not only reflecting on what is happening, it does not only present reality, but it goes beyond reality. It's creative, constructive, productive. And we see that especially elaborated in the philosophy of Gaston Bachelard, French scientist and philosopher, who argued that, in fact, imagination is making present what is absent. Things that are not there can be imagined, can be made present, can be made aware by the imagination as a human faculty. We can create a new world, not as a reflection of the real world, but in our own imagination, we think about what could be happening in the future. And that can instigate us also to act. But before we act, we have to imagine what will be the future. Now, the role of the imagination is therefore, I would say, transcendent. It goes beyond the actual reality, and it refers to a dimension that is in the future. And therefore, I would say it's especially important when we want to go beyond apocalyptic views. If we want to go beyond the pessimism and fatalism of present-day discourses of doom and gloom, we have to use our imagination to think beyond it. And that is what Bachelard also have called the imagination is spiritual mobility. It's the movement of the mind to go and to think beyond what is given and beyond what is impressing us in everyday life, and to see to look at the things that are going on in light of what is possible. There is also a famous phrase of philosopher John Dewey, pragmatic philosopher, but he also attributed an important role to the imagination. Now, why is the imagination important for ethics? There are two reasons that are always mentioned in discourses about moral imagination. One, the imagination helps us to expand our sympathies, to place ourselves in the position of another person, so that we can think and feel and experience what is important from the position of this other person or group of persons. We can overcome our own limited perspective with the help of the imagination. And that's what is called the moral point of view. We take a moral point of view not because we are reflecting our own self-interest, because we can imagine, but because we can imagine what is important for the perspective of other people. And secondly, and philosopher Edith Stein, for example, was one of those philosophers who elaborated this idea of imagination in her work on empathy. And she was a disciple of Edmund Husserl. So you see that this is an important attribute of ethics from the start of this discipline. Secondly, the imagination also helps us to identify possibilities for action. It's not only, only that we can shift our perspective, but we can also think about possibilities to act, to think about different futures, and that instigate us to take steps in a particular direction. And for John Dewey, moral deliberation actually was a kind of internal rehearsal with the help of the imagination of various possible courses of action, so that we could imagine what we could do, have the arguments, and think about it, and then start to propose deliberate action. Now, how can we make this imagination operational? If you are a teacher and you want to appeal to the imagination, How do you do that? And first of all, we have to think that imagination can also be misguiding. People have wrong imaginations. They have imaginations in a direction that is not very helpful. So, and in those cases, we can say what we notice is that imagination often only reproduces what already is there. It's only reproductive. It's not creative, not productive. And in that sense, we often notice a kind of what I would call truncated imagination, where we are fascinated by the end of the world and all the possible catastrophes that can happen without thinking about values and ideals that go beyond this situation. So that we are so absorbed by what is happening and going on that we cannot even use the imagination as a productive discourse. Now, there are two ways, I would argue, that can help to make the imagination operational. That we have to increase the range of ethical concerns. And that has happened in, for example, the development of global bioethics, where we now know that there's a range of ethical principles available. And it has been also argued by the Pope, by this Academy, that we should broaden our view of ethics beyond mainstream bioethics into global bioethics, so that we can combine interest in individual issues with social issues and environmental issues. So we need a broader framework, and we need to transmit that to students, that it's necessary that you look at different aspects, different dimensions of our contemporary existence. And that framework is there. Then secondly, we also should notice that there are many, let's say, tools to stimulate the imagination. And they are available in the humanities. Stories, cases, examples, games, poetic language, metaphors. So we use what is available in the humanities also to help ethics education to be more creative in the terms of imagination. And there's especially more interest now in the use of examples of people, individuals who made a difference. And if you look at Laudato Si, the Pope also uses this in his frequent references to, for example, St. Francis, St. Teresa of Lisieux. And we can encourage students to look for examples in their own environment who give ideals and embody values that are important and who are making a difference, maybe not on a global scale, but in their own limited social environment. And for me, when I was studying medicine and philosophy, I was inspired by two of those examples, and I briefly mentioned them here. The first is Jacques Désiré Laval, who was a medical doctor from Normandy, and he practiced medicine, and then he had an accident. He, after the accident, decided that he wanted to go in another direction. He studied for the priesthood, joined the congregation, and went to the island of Mauritius, where he worked under the recently liberated slaves, the lowest section of the community, and he lived among them. He learned their language. He was a medical doctor, so he could also improve their situation. So he was an example how an individual could change the destiny of a group of people, the destiny of also part of a country, because he's still respected today for the work that he did. Another example for me was Paul Farmer, recently deceased medical doctor from the States. He studied in medicine. He was professor in Harvard. At the same time, he established an NGO who did a lot of work in Haiti, in Rwanda, developing countries, offering free healthcare to the poorest of the poor. So there's also an example how one individual can make a change. And I think we should, in our teaching, also refer and ask people to identify those kind of examples, because they can help us to overcome a fatalistic mood. Now, in conclusion, We have different responses to the present-day apocalyptic mood. All responses apply an ethical point of view, but we need to rethink the purpose and the meaning of the world in which we live. And therefore, I argue there are three stances that you can take in ethics education in general. And I pointed out the role of the imagination, that we have a broader framework and we need more effective exemplars. Thank you very much.
Muchísimas gracias, profesor Ten Hag. Les recuerdo que pueden escribir sus preguntas. Si les faltan bolitos para poderlas escribir, levantan la mano y se las distribuirán. Y también las personas que pueden hacer preguntas a través del chat. Ahora, Monseñor Simar va a presentar a nuestro siguiente ponente.
Thank you. Our second speaker will speak and reflect upon the health perspective. Dr. Hans Kluge is a Belgian medical doctor and public health expert. As of 1st February 2020, he served as the World Health Organization Regional Director for Europe after being nominated in September 2019 by the World Health Organization Regional Committee for Europe. As World Health Organization Regional Director for Europe, Dr. Kluge introduced a new strategic vision for the World Health Organization European region called United Action for Better Health. Dr. Kluge and also initiated the Pan-European Commission on Health and Sustainable Development, an independent and interdisciplinary group of leaders convened to rethink policy priorities in the light of pandemic. In December 2021, Dr. Kluge said, "We can see another storm coming." In February, Kluge said, "This period of higher protection be seen as a ceasefire that could bring us enduring peace." And Dr. also Kluge had teaching at the Institute of Tropical Medicine at the Catholic Universiteit of Leuven. Dr. Kluge.
Thank you, grazie. Excellencies, distinguished guests. It's a profound honor to be here today at a time of great uncertainty in our world. I feel humbled to share the European health perspective, one which is rooted in both science and humanity. Let me begin by saying that I continue to pray for the health and well-being of His Holiness Pope Francis. I also want to express my deep admiration for his leadership and compassion. Actually, his unwavering commitment to standing with the most vulnerable, ensuring that no one is left behind, has always been a source of inspiration for me and all of us at the World Health Organization. On a more personal note, the values of compassion and service have shaped my own journey. My sister and I were raised by our Catholic parents with a strong foundation in Christian values. Some of my most cherished memories are of accompanying my parents on pilgrimages to Lourdes, 40 times in total, where my father, a doctor, and my mother, a nurse, dedicated their holidays to caring for older people and those in need. My sister and I joined them as young volunteers, assisting the people with disabilities. And those experiences instilled in me a lifelong commitment to serving others, particularly the most vulnerable. This same principle, leaving no one behind, is the foundation of my vision for health, and it has guided me throughout my career, from Somalia to Liberia, from Myanmar to Europe, always with a focus on those who are most at risk of being forgotten. Excellencies, dear friends, the state of health security in our world is under attack. 5 years ago, the COVID-19 pandemic was beginning to take hold, just as I assumed my role as the regional director of WHO Europe. Today, I can say with certainty, no health system in our region has fully recovered, and none are fully prepared for the immense health challenges that lie ahead. And just as I began my second term as the regional director this year, unanimously reappointed by our 53 member states, another crisis unfolded: the decision of the United States of America to withdraw from WHO. The repercussions of this decision are immense, not just for WHO, but for global health, and ultimately for the millions of vulnerable people suffering from TB, HIV/AIDS, and other diseases. This crack in our multilateral foundation comes at a time when we are more vulnerable than ever. Powerful megatrends are shaping the trajectories of health and well-being, with increasing threats to health security: climate change, aging, the growing burden of chronic diseases, and rapid technological change. Challenges that nonetheless offer great opportunities if we steer them in the right direction. History has shown us that when we come together, we can overcome even the most complex crises. This is why multilateralism is not an option, it's a necessity. No country, no institution, no leader can solve these problems alone. And this is precisely the vision that guides the development of WHO Europe's second European Programme of Work. Immediately after my re-election, I launched an unprecedented consultation process, bringing together 53 governments, civil society, and partners to forge a shared vision for health in Europe. At its core are 5 open hearings, engaging thousands of the brightest minds in Europe's public health community to shape a collective agenda for action. And indeed, a rich agenda for action is emerging from those 5 hearings, calling for bold steps. And I'm pleased to see that the Holy See is already actively engaged in addressing these megatrends and challenges. In many ways, the Holy See and WHO share a common perspective on potential solutions. Let me now highlight 5 key areas for action and explore the opportunities for a common agenda. Common agenda action number 1, health emergencies. Health and peace are inseparable. Armed conflicts in Ukraine, Gaza, Lebanon, Sudan, Myanmar, and elsewhere continue to inflict immense suffering. As I often say, the most urgent medicine we need today is peace. But peace alone is not enough to guarantee health security. From antimicrobial resistance to the resurgence of vaccine-preventable diseases like measles and polio, we face a rapidly evolving health security landscape. WHO continues to call for action on 3 fronts. Number 1, protecting healthcare in conflict zones. No health worker should ever be attacked. No hospital should ever be a target. We urge all nations and actors to uphold international humanitarian law and ensure the protection of health facilities and workers. There used to be a time that a white coat was sacred. It's very scary to see this new reality, that healthcare workers and hospitals are attacked without mercy. Second action, strengthening preparedness for emerging threats through early detection, response systems, and global cooperation. Here I would like to congratulate the Minister of Health of Italy Professor Orazio Schillaci, who I met yesterday, for his leadership under the G7 on global pandemic preparedness. The third action is reaffirming international solidarity. The Vatican played a vital role in the COVID-19 response, with the Holy Father's endorsements of vaccination as an act of love and a moral duty, making a profound impact. We need the same spirit of solidarity today, ensuring equitable access to vaccines and all essential health services, prioritizing the most vulnerable, and standing firm in the belief that no one is safe until everyone is safe. Common agenda action number 2, aging. We need a paradigm shift. Aging is not a disease to be treated. Aging is a privilege. Aging is living. For the first time in history, Europe's older population outnumbers its youth. This, on one hand, is a testament to our public health success, but it's also a call to action. By 2050, the number of people over 65 is expected to double, while those over 80 years will triple. There is a silent epidemic of what we call ageism and isolation, both major killers. 1 in 3 people experiences ageism. 1 in 4 older adults feels isolated. And social isolation increases the risk of every early death by 25%. Last year, I was deeply inspired by my meeting with Archbishop Monsignor Vincenzo Paglia, the president of the Pontifical Academy for Life, and by attending the Mass at the Basilica di Santa Maria in Trastevere. And we decided to work closely together, also with Professor Walter Ricciardi from the Catholic University of the Sacred Heart in Rome, on the Charter for the Rights of Elderly People and the Duties of the Community, the Carta dei diritti degli anziani e dei doveri della comunità. This initiative underscores the need for societies to treat aging populations with dignity and respect. If you ask the elderly people what they need most, they never say health. They say all the same, please do not belittle us. Don't treat us as children. Dignity. Our agenda for action must focus on 4 key priorities here. Number 1, ensuring that healthy aging begins early by embedding prevention approaches from the childhood age. An example is our work in Ukraine, where we are working with the First Lady, Madame Olena Zelensky, on healthy nutrition in schools. Make the children resilient from early on. Number 2, building age-friendly health and social care systems that integrate primary health care, mental health, and community services to support independent living. Number 3, tackling ageism and promoting social participation by fostering intergenerational connections and inclusive policies that value older people as active contributors to society. I always say, thanks God that I still have my parents who are sharing their values with my 2 daughters, because I'm so busy traveling, including to the Vatican. Number 4, supporting caregivers and strengthening long-term care through sustainable investments in workforce training, home-based services, and innovative care models. Common agenda action number 3, addressing violence. Globally, 1 in 3 women experiences physical and/or sexual violence in their lifetime. As a father of 2 daughters, I cannot accept that this remains a reality. Violence against women and girls is a pervasive global health problem and a violation of human rights. Actually, this morning, I discussed this with the President of the Health, Labour and Social Affairs Committee of the Italian Parliament, Excellency Francesco Zafani, and we're also going to collaborate in this area. because it has devastating long-term health consequences, physical, sexual, reproductive, and mental. And the women with disabilities, indigenous women and trans women face an even higher risk. And despite global commitments, actually little progress has been made since the Beijing Declaration 30 years ago. LGBTIQ+ communities endure stigma, discrimination, and violence that severely impact their well-being. I deeply appreciate the Holy See's messages of acceptance towards LGBTQI+ individuals. Stigma and discrimination lead to significant mental and physical health challenges for our fellow human beings. The Vatican's leadership is vital in creating a more inclusive and dignified future for all. Our health system must be safe, inclusive, and responsive. Often they are the first or only point of contact for survivors. This is our target for action. I will launch 8 March at the International Women's Day a special initiative on addressing violence against women and girls in the pan-European region. And I'm very inspired that yesterday I got the support of Minister Schillaci, who will also join us here. So strengthening health systems to provide survivor-centered care is key. And training the personnel. Because what we see is that when the survivors approach health systems, often healthcare workers don't see it as a health issue. Number 2, we need to embed prevention into health policies and look at the root causes. Gender inequality, harmful masculine norms, and the social determinants of violence. And third, fostering inclusion and non-discrimination, eliminating bias and stigma. Common agenda action number 4 on climate action. Quite simply, the climate crisis is a health crisis. Last year was the hottest year in our history in our European region, with 160,000 people passing away due to heat. Climate change is responsible for an estimated 250,000 additional deaths each year. Again, disproportionately affecting the most vulnerable. Actually, if there will be, not if, when there will be another pandemic, we know perfectly well who will die again the first. It are the youngest and the oldest, it are the people with least resources in society, and it are the people with pre-existing chronic diseases like cancer, heart disease, respiratory disease, diabetes. Our agenda for action focuses on 3 key priorities. Adapting the health services to better cope with a new climate reality, but in a very, very pragmatic way. Because 53 ministers are telling, we have a shortage in health workforce. We don't know how to pay for the new innovative medicines, and now we have to green our health systems. So we need to be very pragmatic. For example, heat health action plans. Because what my ministers are telling is that previously during the summer, the health systems got a breath before the respiratory disease again attack in autumn. But now, even in the summer, the health systems are cracking and the emergency services due to the heat. To invest in climate-smart health systems, low-carbon healthcare. If the health systems in the world would be a country, it would be the 5th most polluting country, responsible between 4 and 8% of the greenhouse gas emissions. Common agenda action number 5, rebuilding trust. We are experiencing one of the lowest points of trust in science, public health, and institutions in modern history, from vaccines to climate change, public health measures and medical ethics. The Vatican has long played a crucial role in bridging science and ethics, ensuring that public health policies align with human dignity and moral responsibility. Yet today, misinformation and disinformation threatens not only health systems, but the ability of faith-based leadership to guide communities toward truth and solidarity. Rebuilding trust demands a renewed commitment to transparency, inclusion, and ethical leadership. The WHO and the Vatican have a unique opportunity to stand together in this fight, not only to combat misinformation and falsehoods, but to restore faith in health as a fundamental pillar of human dignity and solidarity. So our agenda for action must focus on 3 key priorities. Number 1, strengthen public health communication. Talk people language. Even in WHO, I still have a lot of work to do with my folks. Talking too complicated language. I always say, if my grandmother doesn't understand what I tell, go back to the drawing board. Number 2, build trust through community engagement by working with faith leaders and civil society. In many countries, civil society is under pressure. And number 3, regulation of digital spaces. I'm coming to the end now. 2, aligning our agendas for a healthier future. The challenges we face today are too great for any one institution, government or sector to solve alone. That's why I'm very pleased that today we release a press statement with the Pontifical Academy for Life to address these contemporary health challenges. By combining WHO scientific expertise with the Holy See's moral leadership and global reach, we can create solutions that are evidence-based, ethically grounded, and deeply rooted in human dignity. Let me finish with a quote from Ecclesiastes, which reminds us, 2 are better than 1, because they have a good return for their labor. If either of them falls down, one can help the other up. But pity anyone who falls and has no one to help them up. Health is a right, not a privilege. Let us be the generation that does more than hope for a healthier world. Let us work tirelessly to build it together and leave no one behind. God bless the Holy Father. Amen.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kluge, and I think there is hope if we take care of the most vulnerable members of our world, and if we are united in the collective actions, and if we strengthen trust and solidarity. Thank you so much. And now it's time for the questions. So I will let Margarita, or you start maybe 2 questions, and we will pass, but we have time.
I was arguing that in ethics education you have 2 possible roads. One road is, so to speak, from the top, and the other one is from below. From the top means that many changes can be made by governments, collectives, like international organizations. On the other hand, we can make changes because individuals undertake particular action. So one question is that it's very interesting to hear about the existence of global bioethics and its ethical framework, because that can guide actions from the top. But then it is necessary to change study methods. And I think you're right. This question, it means that you still, even if you are aware that you have this global framework, it needs to be internalized, it needs to be applied. And what I usually do with students is, you probably do it too, to focus on particular examples of global problems. This is, for example, problem of migration, of trafficking, organ trafficking, or a particular case of fake medicine, counterfeited drugs. And then they say, well, that is a real case. It's described in the literature. What would you do if you reflect upon the case? Why is it ethically not acceptable? What kind of principles are at stake? And if you can identify the principles, what will be a way to address the problem? So you still have not only to present the global framework, but you have to put it into relation to particular examples. Now, that is easy in an educational context, but not easy in a global context, because governments, for example, have adopted this international declaration of global bioethics, but they simply don't apply it. And then you say you have a problem, but still those declarations are not only applied, not only adopted to motivate governments, they are expressing a consensus that is relevant for all citizens. And we see the same in human rights discourse. We know human rights discourse not applied by many countries, even the countries that have adopted the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, they do not apply human rights language. But still, citizens can appeal to the same human rights to bring their governments to court, for example. And that's what we see happening. So it's a framework that not only motivates governments, but it's there for all citizens. And I think the same can happen in global bioethics, that we need to be aware that if governments express that concern for future generations is an important ethical consideration, that it's up to each citizen to argue that this is an important moral question. So I agree that it's necessary to be very innovative in applying this framework in order to make it work. A number of questions concern the other approach in ethics, where individuals undertake particular action. And I articulated that in particular because we sometimes have a feeling that we cannot change our surroundings, we cannot change processes that lead to decline because they're too big, too intractable. But I still argue that individuals can make a difference. And we need to identify those individuals. They will not change the world, but they will change their own limited social context. And if sufficient number of people do that, there will be a movement and there will be sufficient change. So that's why I was referring to the use of exemplars. One question is, why did I mention Teilhard de Chardin as an exemplar? And I could have mentioned him, but I could have mentioned many others. Teilhard de Chardin is interesting because he was inspiring Van Rensselaer-Potter, who coined the term bioethics in the 70s, and he was motivated because his attention was directed at the future. And Potter coined the word bioethics to refer to the future, because what is important for ethical considerations is the survival of humankind. And that was the motivation of Teilhard de Chardin for Potter. But I could have mentioned him as an exemplar. What do I do? Another question is about the power of giving students examples. And I mentioned Paul Farmer. Can I mention other examples? What I usually do when I teach is to ask students to identify examples. What are motivating persons in their own environment? And they come up with a variety of examples. Everybody has those examples in his or her environment. And for example, during the COVID, there were students who organized networks to deliver food to people, older people who could not leave their homes. And they organized that. There was one person who had the idea, and he created a network, and he motivated other people to do that. So it was an example of how people care about each other. Not only distrust each other, but they care for each other. And if you are able to identify those examples in your own surroundings, it will be motivational.
Dr. Kluge. And if
I almost feel like in the European Parliament, so many questions. So I will try to be short, but very good questions. So, Dr. Kluge, you mentioned priority on violence for women and acceptance of LGBT plus individuals. How are you going to improve and to protect men? So, the core of my vision, United Action for Better Health is all around leaving no one behind. So each individual counts. Very concrete then, about men, what's the big challenge that we have in our region is that our men die too young in an economically competitive age, mainly due to 4 diseases. We call them in our jargon non-communicable diseases because they are different than infectious disease. It is especially cardiovascular disease, heart attacks, strokes, respiratory disease, diabetes, and cancer. And there are 4 main risk factors which we are working on with the countries: tobacco, alcohol, lack of physical activity, and unhealthy diet. A lot of those have to do what we call the commercial determinants of health. Under the Belgian European Union presidency, we launched with the Ministry of Health our first report on the commercial determinants of health, where we demystified an orchestrated playbook by the industry. There are 4 industries which basically are killing 7,500 people every single day, mostly men, in our region. And they are the fossil fuels, the unhealthy diet, tobacco, and alcohol. We have a lot of influence also in the parliaments. So we need to create this healthy lifestyle. If everyone would do in Europe what I'm doing every day, meaning 25 minutes of moderate physical activity, it would save 12,000 lives a year in OECD countries, especially men, and save 8 billion euro, free of charge. This is one question. Another question: how will the politics of President Trump influence the WHO? So the US is a founding member of WHO since 1948 and has done a lot for global health, not only finance, but also on policy, sending, for example, people from the US Center of Disease Control. So, of course, we regret very much this decision. We hope that the US will reconsider. And what WHO, meanwhile, is doing is working on a number of fronts. Number 1 is what I call to stop the bleeding, tighten the belt. So, for example, my visit here is exceptional because we are, again, more or less in COVID mode, traveling less and strategizing. Number 2 is reprioritizing. Actually, I call it deprioritizing. For me, this is not the end of the world. It's a catharsis. And what I'm doing is to reimagine WHO. WHO has to go back to the future. What is our main turf? Our main turf is not producing vaccines. UNICEF can do WFP, World Food Programme. This, our main turf is technical excellence, is normative function. That's why I immediately appointed Chief Scientific Advisor. And we have to listen to the countries and be politically neutral. I never choose sides. That's not my turf. Straight after 7 October, I'm the only UN high-level official who went to Israel, to the victims of the girls, the women at the Nova Festival. We have a large mental health program with the First Lady, Madame Herzog. At the same time, every single day I work on medical evacuation of children with cancer, with heavy wounds from Gaza. We are working for Ukraine. We're working for people left behind in the Russian Federation, Armenia, Azerbaijan. It's very important that WHO should never allow health to be politicized, because then we're lost. So we have to be strict on that one. And third one, focused resource mobilization. And there are countries. Kazakhstan is doubling its budget to WHO. Turkey, Azerbaijan, we have to think out of the box. Next question. How do you know artificial intelligence will have any moral values? Actually, to be honest, it's a question I wanted to ask many of you, because there's leading ethicists here. But what is, again, it goes back to the main principle of WHO. What's our main turf or comparative advantage in this whole complicated field of technology and artificial intelligence? It is to leave no one behind. Very concrete. If we are going to have medical appointments only electronically, and the elderly population or the rural population in Tajikistan has no computer or internet, we are leaving them behind. So we have to be the watchdog of humanity. Seems sometimes that the health system takes resources, leaving many health people in fragility and poorness. It's a very important point. We have a survey of all countries on what we call out-of-pocket payments. Actually, in our countries, between 4 and 14% of the households are being pushed into poverty due to ill health. And it's mainly because they cannot pay for medicines for chronic diseases. This is unacceptable. A mother alone, for example, should never have to make the choice between purchasing medicines for her child with a rare disease or having the money to send her child to the school. So we are working on countries, on policies. It's not always a matter of money. It's a matter of sound policies and protecting the poor and the vulnerable. What actions are you taking for suicide? Mental health is a top priority. And I'm very happy with joining with ministers also in Italy, Schillaci, with the parliament. 28% of the girls aged 15 years in our region, 14% of the boys aged 15 years in our region tells that they feel lonely the whole time or most of the time. Loneliness is a killer. But also in aging, people divorce later. They are later alone because the partner passes away. Loneliness is a big one with suicide. So we are working with countries on suicide prevention plans. There is one word there. Again, it does not cost money. It's called, actually 2 words, social connection. Social connection can lift people out of depression and loneliness. We have a particular program for the first time on suicide prevention in youth in Greenland, where this is a big topic. Thank you. Yes. People can maybe approach me during the lunch. Yes.
But thank you so much. I think our speaker deserves another good applause.
I have 2 more questions. Thank you. Gracias.
And Monsieur Renzo has a communication before lunch.
Okay. Grazie ancora per gli speakers di tutta la mattinata, molto ricca e stimolante. 2 comunicazioni veloci di servizio. Ora abbiamo il pranzo e per motivi pratici cerchiamo di organizzarlo bene in questo modo. Tutti i partecipanti che non sono membri dell'Accademia, tutti i partecipanti non membri dell'Accademia, possono ricevere uscendo un piccolo box per il pranzo e c'è anche una sala disponibile fuori, quindi ci si può sedere, si può stare al coperto chi preferisce o respirare l'aria e il sole di Roma e quindi uscendo, andando a sinistra, troverete la distribuzione di questo lunch e potete accomodarvi fuori o in questa sala. Sopra vanno i membri dell'Accademia, gli speakers e alcuni ospiti dell'Accademia. Ricordiamo che dobbiamo assolutamente ripartire alle 2:30. Alle 14:30 dobbiamo iniziare perché c'è un panel estremamente anche interessante con dei premi Nobel che sono disponibili a interagire sulla proposta del nostro lavoro. E ricordo poi che i poster molto interessanti e molto ben fatti sono adesso disponibili sotto scala, c'è un po' più di spazio e potete in qualsiasi momento anche fermarvi e ci sono coloro che hanno preparato i poster disponibili anche per alcune spiegazioni. Per i membri dell'Accademia stasera c'è anche la cena sociale alle ore 8 che sarà in via dell'Ospedale 1, è una laterale di via della Conciliazione. Via dell'Ospedale numero 1 alle ore 8 questa sera. Buon pranzo e arrivederci alle 14:30. Thank you very much.
It was a great honor for me. My parents are very proud of it.
Oh, I think so.
You can count on me.